Egypt is preparing for a new influx of refugees as the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz pushes the Middle East into a phase of extreme risk. The United States' mobilization to reopen the maritime passage this Saturday, April 25, 2026, is not just a naval operation. It is a sign that the Gulf War could return in another form, and Iran's brutal repression is causing more human displacement and more pressure on nations that are already living on the edge. The crisis begins at sea, but it is expected to end at the borders. The most sensitive point now is not just oil, it's the civilian population. With the war expected to return on a larger scale, a new wave of departures from Iran is looming. I'll tell you all about that in a moment, but right now, you'll want to be subscribed to the channel to stay well informed, real-time information, with the best journalistic quality you've ever seen. Milson Alves News, the standard for credibility. Here's what's happening. Egypt and the nations surrounding Iran are already looking at the crisis in Iran as a migration time bomb in the making. Egypt, even without sharing a border with Iran, already hosts about 1,099,000 refugees and asylum seekers registered by the UN Refugee Agency. In addition to official data citing 1.5 million Sudanese who have fled to Egyptian territory since the beginning of the war in Sudan. At the same time, Turkey, which shares a direct border with Iran, has already become an escape route for Iranians trying to flee instability. The Associated Press reported that many Iranians are trying to travel, maintain visas, or seek temporary safety. Iraq, Pakistan, and other neighboring areas are also on alert because they are already dealing with displaced people, refugees, and strained public services. Al Jazeera reported in March 2026 that Iran's neighboring nations were quietly preparing for a possible exodus. While UN humanitarian reports warn about the growing risk of internal displacement, new departures across borders, and movements to other nations. The problem is simple and serious. If war returns to the Gulf with force, it's not just ships that go off course, but entire families seeking safety. And when this movement starts, it puts pressure on housing, hospitals, schools, jobs, public safety, and food in nations that are already overwhelmed. After the Islamic Revolution of 1979, thousands of Iranians left the country due to political fear, persecution, economic crisis, and social upheaval. Then came the war, and the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 expanded the displacement and fueled a diaspora that spread across Europe, North America, and other regions. Studies on Iranian migration indicate that Iran has become one of the main sources of asylum seekers in Europe since the Islamic Revolution. That past weighs on the present. The old war between Iran and Iraq did not only produce dead soldiers and damaged cities. It pushed families out of vulnerable areas, increased the escape of opponents, and left a deep mark on Iranian society. A study on memory and Iranian exile records that the peak of asylum requests linked to this wave occurred in 1988. With more than 47,000 applicants, this is not a detail lost in history, it's a warning. When military pressure combines with internal repression and economic crisis, fleeing becomes a choice for survival. Now, the fear is that this scenario will repeat itself on a new scale. Iran is already under pressure from sanctions, maritime blockades, internal tension, loss of confidence, and threats of new attacks. If the American response moves beyond naval operations and escalates to tougher operations, many people inside Iran might feel that it's time to leave before the borders become even harder to cross. The natural route for many Iranians would be first through Turkey, Iraq, the Caucasus, the Gulf, or by air routes that are still open. But in a regional crisis, movement isn't limited to the first destination. It spreads through family networks, smuggling routes, asylum claims, and humanitarian corridors. This is where Egypt emerges as a nation on alert. Cairo isn't directly on Iran's border, but it's at the center of the accumulating crises. Egypt has the Suez Canal, is connected to Gaza, faces pressure from Sudan, maintains dialogue with the Gulf, and serves as a transit and settlement point for different communities. If the Gulf enters a new war, Egypt doesn't just face the diplomatic impact, it also faces human, economic, and security impacts. The possible departure of Iranians adds to this as a new source of pressure. In a regional war, some of the displaced people may look for alternative routes, especially when other paths become expensive, closed, or dangerous. And Egypt, because of its position and its diplomatic network, tends to be affected by any major population movement in the Middle East. The American mobilization increases this risk because it shows that Washington does not intend to accept Hormuz as a permanent tool of blackmail. The United Kingdom's House of Commons recorded that on April 13, the United States launched a counter-blockade targeting ships attempting to reach Iranian ports. While the reopening of the strait became a central point in the negotiations mediated by Pakistan, Iran, in turn, threatened military action if the American blockade does not end. The document that is circulating also draws attention to Egypt's discrete role in mediating the crisis. The Carnegie Endowment stated that Egyptian intermediaries reportedly conveyed American concerns about escalation in the Gulf, as well as Iranian warnings about possible retaliation if the conflict escalated. This shows that Cairo is not far from the problem. It is trying to manage the crisis before it fully reaches its doorstep, but diplomacy may not be enough. If the war returns on land, at sea, and in the air at the same time, Egypt will be called upon to take a stand. The Gulf may demand support. The United States may demand cooperation. Israel will monitor every move. And the European nations, concerned about energy and migration, will also push for stability. Cairo will have to protect its economy, its territory, and its social cohesion at the same time. The history of the region teaches that wars do not end where they begin. The Islamic Revolution led to exile. The war between Iran and Iraq caused displacement. The Gulf War affected armies, oil, and alliances. The war in Syria pushed millions out of their homes. The conflict in Sudan is already weighing on Egypt. Now, a new crisis with Iran could open another humanitarian front, less visible than the aircraft carriers, but just as explosive for long-term stability. The main point is that refugees don't appear out of nowhere. They appear when the state fails to provide security. When the war comes close to Malaga, when the currency loses value, when fear overcomes routine, and when families realize that waiting could be costly. In the Iranian case, there is a historical memory of fleeing. There is a diaspora formed by decades of political upheaval. There is a generation that already knows where to run, who to look for, and how to try to leave. If the war escalates, this network can be activated quickly. Meanwhile, the United States is pressing ahead with its military approach. Reopening Hormuz has become a symbol of strength. Washington wants to prove that Iran cannot threaten the global economy and be rewarded for it. But every military move has a side effect. If the pressure brings down Iranian trade, the likelihood of flight increases. If more people flee, neighboring and partner nations pay the price. And Egypt, because it sits at the center of the region's political and migration landscape, falls into the impact zone. Like this video, subscribe to the channel. At the end, check the comments to engage more with the Milson Alves news community.